Sounds good. Sorry for being late, bro. I know giving you a little nerves there, I bet.
Oh, no worries. No worries. Hello, hello. Thank you for joining us. Welcome to the Thursday process. You are in the right place. Even if you're not, stick around. We're going to get started in just 2 minutes. If you got to grab a glass of water, get a cup of coffee, something like that, now's the time. We'll get started at 11:32 Eastern time, or 2 minutes past the half hour, wherever you're at. So, looking forward to diving into this. You're in Fort Worth, Matt, right now?
I am. Yeah, I'm in the venerable Fort Worth Club today, as a matter of fact.
So the Fort Worth Club.
Yes.
Very
posh.
Very posh. Okay. That's better than the random Fairfields and Hampton and whatever other crummy category 2 hotel I find myself in most days.
Well, JP Kesey's very kind to me, so I'm down here doing his he's doing a presentation to a bunch of his clients, and I'm going to be doing a live hacking demonstration of an OAuth token theft. So,
oh, nice, man. There you go. So he's just going to be sitting there at the side with like a little contract for a upsell, cross-sell, right? Like,
yeah, exactly. He's just going to be cashing the checks. Yeah. It's funny. A lot of these MSPs doing this, and maybe one day we do a process on, I think you may actually have already done so. But people doing this right now are seeing great success, educating their partners, educating their clients. It's been fantastic.
Yeah, for those of you who are tuning in, we had George Bardisi on sharing his process on how to plan an event. So you can view that on demand, and shoot me an email if you'd like that process doc. But that's what we're talking about here, is you can be hosting these client security events and throw it off really, really well. So
I think last year he added 30,000 in MRR from the event. I think let's just put that in perspective, right? Like, yeah, it was
a cool $360,000. No,
yeah, it's not a bad run rate to have in the bank.
All right. Hey, we're 2 minutes past the hour, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining us. For those of you flowing in, we're just getting started. Appreciate everyone taking some time today. Welcome to the Thursday process. A quick disclaimer before we dive into content. Presentations on Thursday process are intended for educational purposes only. They should never replace your independent judgment or independent professional advice, especially around today's topic on security. Statements of facts and opinions expressed are those of the participants individually. These do not represent the opinion or position of their employers or certifying bodies. So this is Matt and Ian talking, nobody else. Nothing presented here should be considered legal or financial advice. So we're not lawyers and we're not accountants. So go talk to those folks if you're worried about that.
Right, because I was going to tell people to buy Enron as soon as they can. You know?
Perfect.
Great.
There advice. You go. Hammer that GameStop stuff. Right? You might be watching this on demand. If so, please consider we do not update the information after the initial recording. Today is March 23rd, 2023. So what you see is what you get. There hasn't been updates since the original presentation. Quick little bit of housekeeping. There are polls that happen throughout Thursday process. They're going to start in a couple of minutes. There's only 5 of them. They're multiple choice. It's super fast, but all of those polls help me guide future presentations. So it's really, really important if you select in and choose those items on the polls, that helps me kind of guide and steer. Likewise, if you know someone who you think should be on Thursday process, reach out to me. My contact info is going to be on the last slide, or ping me on LinkedIn. Love to have that recommendation. If you have questions, don't hold them back. Use the Q&A panel in the upper right-hand corner. I will stitch them into the conversation. If you don't ask, we've got a couple of minutes at the end for them, but I'd much rather stitch them into the conversation as we go, so don't hold them back. And last but not least, there is a handout in the handout section that you can download. Again, upper right-hand corner, go ahead and grab that. That's the document I'm going to be working off of, and you can follow along if you so desire. But that's yours to keep. Without further ado, who are we? I'm Ian Richardson. I'm one half and the far worse looking of the Richardsons, along with my wife, Carrie. We run Richardson & Richardson Consulting. We're a strategic planning, management, and sales and marketing consulting agency. Before doing that, I ran an MSP for 16 years, so security is near and dear to my heart. I was a healthcare vertical specific guy for all 16 of those years, and I'm joined by my good friend, now bearded compatriot Matt Lee. I've got a pillow of his beard somewhere in this house.
That's not something you'd ever expect a human to be able to say about another human, unless they maybe were a voodoo participant in some form or fashion. But
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. And that, above everything else, is going to be the audiogram clip on LinkedIn soon.
Great.
So Matt, you're the senior director of security and compliance at Pax8. Bearded wizard, cyber Matley, and all around super good human.
Thanks, man.
But why don't you just take a couple of minutes, and before you joined Pax8, what's your history in IT and security?
So, really early on, I started out with my Series 7 66 LHVA as a broker and a banker and a mortgage guy. And every 3 or 4 years, I'd find myself changing careers. I mean, I even did numismatic and non-numismatic gold and diamond buying, at least milli and sub carat. But yeah, I kind of bounced around a lot in things. But then I found technology, and I started with a small MSP in Wichita, Kansas in 2011 that was just converting from contract to block hour contracts, things like that, to a more significant MSP type business, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I grew through each of the different roles, right? I was a bench tech, and then ultimately a technician, and then an IA, and then a project guy. And then, one of the things that I found myself doing, Ian, was I just said yes to every project. I would work every day. I'd work every night. I'd work every weekend. I'd solve every problem. And I got a rush from that, right? Actually, I really enjoyed being the Superman, if you will, and saving the day. But that said, I eventually went through a bit of a change and went into more director of technology and driving our technology decisions, and then ultimately security. But I really found myself in security by accident, and I'll steal a book from Juan Fernandez, but I was an accidental security guy in the sense that I was named as the head of security because I believed in what we were doing and how we were doing it. But I actually hadn't really figured out what I was going to do. And so I wrote an email. I actually found a picture of this email. I had my former VP of operations send me the picture, but it says my single greatest fear. And I sent that email out on a Wednesday in October. And it was right after our merger to be a roughly 28 million or so revenue MSP at that time. I guess I forgot to say that we grew it up through 1, 3, 5, 7, 28, jumped some steps there, and then 50 and 40, 40 million. And through that, we bought an MSP, and I call them Voldemort now. I won't name the name. And I call him Voldemort. And I did during the whole event. And for 18 months, we lost to Soda no Kibi, or our evil ransomware gang, 1,200 endpoints. Every client fired us. Every employee quit. We basically had a empty shell of a company that we acquired for $1 million. Go away. And the insurance claim paid $280,000, and we lost another $1 million in run rate, and we lost the opportunity cost of another acquisition. And so when you get down to it, boy, when you've been burned like that, it just changes who you are. And so then that's when I sent out this, really finalized aspect of, all right, we're going to make some changes around here, y'all. And we were one of the first MSPs to push back about having SSO, and to push back and say, hey, guys, this RBAC is crap. There's no ABAC. I can't do what I want to do. I can't do the things that are necessary to meet security. And at that time, it was being just pragmatic of the things I thought we needed to do from general knowledge. It wasn't framework oriented. And maybe I'm dropping you right into the conversation. But as that pivot started happening, it got easier to win those arguments because I wasn't making up, I need this to be this way for this. No, I was saying if I can't meet 5.6 and 6.7 with SCIM provisioning and 5.6 being SSO, then I can't use your product. And then we're going to move on. Right. And that started doing things. When you're spending, $1 million with a company, it really gets attention. And I guess through that, I kind of learned how broken so many of these vendors were in that understanding. And so I started putting my efforts with 24 different, I think, or 26 different advisory panels over the years that I sat on, just trying to judge one thing. Can I make a change here? Can I influence some process difference in their world that they actually protect us and do the things that are necessary? And it comes back to, where my role landed now, which was, where can I make the greatest good impact, right? I felt like I was making a great impact in advising these companies, and I still do. But now I'm allowed to actually educate MSPs on a daily basis. And I don't say educate. I don't want that to sound like I know more than them. I would just say force people to think about the things that they need to think about before they get punched in the face. Like my eyes used to point in the straight direction. Right? Now, got him. But my point is, you get punched once and you get a little cross-eyed. But I'm blessed to be able to do that every day, all day. And Pax8, I like to say, sponsors my breakfast, lunch, dinners, and place I lay my head. So it's pretty nice.
Yeah, the a quick aside, I just saw the rampant tweet meme around relating risk to getting punched in the face, right? And
Yeah, I saw
acceptable
that one.
risk
It's
is how
good.
willing are you? How willing are you to take a punch in the face?
Yeah, true story. It's a good one.
Yeah.
It's a good one.
And so diving into the process that we're talking about, for those of you following along, I'll try to call out the bullet point number
Yeah.
as we jump up and down in this document. A quick note: the framework that Matt and I talked about in our prep call and is referenced through this document is CIS, but you can apply this however you might want to whichever framework, right? The process is
Yes.
designed to be
Yeah.
genericized and to give you kind of some guidelines and guardrails to keep you on the path. So let's start off with number one, Matt. There's a ton of different frameworks out there. There's a ton of different people advocating a ton of different things. There's a lot of crossover, but when it came down to researching and saying, all right, this is the framework that I'm going to advocate for, just talk us through a little bit on your thought process. What were you thinking, and what kind of helped you settle on CIS as, like, you know what, this is going to be my standard that I push?
Yeah. So here's the dirty secret. All of the different frameworks basically say similar things. And what we call that is crosswalking, right? In the sense that this framework might say, put on MFA and do it this way, but another framework says you should use MFA. And so those have crosswalkability. So remember, you're not pigeonholing yourself by choosing a framework. So that'd be the first thing that I'd say kind of in my mind. But it really starts with the business decisions, right? It really just starts with, do I have some business reason I must use one framework or another framework first, right? So if there's a need for a SOC 2, you're probably going to start with SOC 2, not CIS. And in the same breath, if you need a CMMC or 80171 assertion of some sort, SPUR score, whatever it may be, then you're going to use those because you're in the DIB, Defense Industrial Base, and that's what you have to do. So that said, if you remove that first decision of, do I have a business reason that I must choose a framework, then now we come down to pragmatism and what are we trying to get out of it. And so most companies do not find themselves in a regulated world. They don't find themselves needing SOC 2 or needing a CMMC. And so I would go by, what can I implement? What's going to make the biggest impact in my overall security? And when you're comparing NIST CSF, which is about to go through a revision, and it's going to be in 2.0, but it's just, you can tell it's written by a bunch of scientists. And so for me, it was, what gives me pragmatic advice? What's going to be something that my customers will understand? And so if you're thinking about it that way, it's, does it meet the security need? Is it going to help in that way? CIS is a very security focused, very, very plain language, very, very understanding that you're going to have to iterate within it. And I'll give you an example. It says, have MFA on accounts. On what accounts? Right? What software? What are we talking about? The breadth of it is massive. And so anyways, getting back to it, it's really about what can give you pragmatic and easy guide towards something if you don't have business aspects that are driving it, like Cyber Essentials in the UK or Europe, or the Elite 8 in Australia. But if you focus on the CIS, it is really broad and does a very good job of actually encompassing most of those other controls, at least the technical and administrative things, pretty well. So that's why I ended up landing on it. But essentially, it's what can I implement, and whether or not I have another requirement, like Tim Choquette, I think that is, says NIST 80171 exactly.
Yep.
So
once you've kind of chosen that framework, creating that project plan and accounting for in the plan that, hey, like, we're gonna mess up, we're gonna have failures, we're gonna have roadblocks, we're gonna take one step forward and then run a mile back. And have to retrace our steps because we're going to find something that we screwed up earlier, was emphasized. But one of the key things to bring up is step 5 and step 6. And I'll do step 6 first, kind of keeping in mind the mantra of perfection is the enemy of greatness. So that, like, don't strive to have every single I dotted and T crossed. Like, go from 0 to 50. And then 50 to 75, and then 75 to 78. Don't aim for 100 right out of the gate. But then also, when you're rolling this out, don't try to do everything all at once. Like, hey, you have 50 different systems that you're managing between you and your various clients. Choose a system, run through a control, then run that control through the next system, then run through that control through the next system. and kind of implement in stages. And
Yeah.
if you could just kind of talk about how you tackle, like, hey, we've got 50 disparate systems. What are we going to do to kind of organize and tackle things? Do you do control groups across systems? Do you just secure one system through groups and then move to the next system? What's your normal MO for this?
It depends. I'll give you a great example. Let's say I'm implementing Control 5.6, right? And, your point of, what's the breadth of it? What are all the systems? Well, that's Control 2. You're going to start listing between Control 1 and Control 2. You're going to start listing most of the software assets and assets that you have. But back to your point on point 6, you're not going to be effective 100%. You're going to miss something. You're going to find something as you're doing something else. You're going to find shadow IT. You're going to find things that you have to deal with. But let's get back into the lens of implementing and how do you do it. For me, it's going to be case by case where you can choose which path you want to do. Do you want to be holistic of a particular data set first, or do you want to be, individual meeting a control first, right? And so I would probably approach it from a sensitivity of the data first, in the sense that if I can identify systems that are significantly more impactful to my business from a business impact perspective, or if I can identify systems that are more risky to me from a data sensitivity and what they hold perspective, then I would probably prefer to focus on sorting through each of the bodies of that control as I approach them, right? So as I'm doing 5, I would want to start by getting those done first. But let's go back to that SSO. Each different product is going to have a different plan, right? Each product may or may not gracefully handle SSO. You may have email address changes to make it happen. You might actually lose data because you're having to create new users that destroy the old users because they don't do a good translation. And so when I was going through that process, I think we did 67 apps through SSO ultimately, right? So we were bringing into SSO 60 something apps. And as we did that, it was each one a different project plan with different outcomes, with different preparing our users for what was about to happen and what they could expect, and sometimes screwing it up pretty handily. So I would probably say I'm still going to follow the IG1s, IG2s, and IG3s. And CIS, for anybody that doesn't know, they're organized in Sheldon Phillips and I get into arguments back and forth of how those implementation groups should be organized. That said, it's really going to be, for me, I'm going to try to do by sensitivity first through the IGs and get through that IG1 first, right? And it is kind of iterative. When I get done with IG1, I'm going to come back for an IG2 pass to that point. So anyways, but yeah, I would start with data sensitivity and go broad across a control first, or a safeguard and control first.
Yeah. And then narrow from there after you gain that perspective. And so you almost tapped into point 8 there. So I'll jump down to that, which is as you're kind of working through the framework, create some gap analysis of where your current state is, where you need to be at, figure out what solutions are going to be for each gap. So, like, hey, I can use this tool here, or I can configure this setting there, or we can modify our process procedure in this way to achieve that. And then try to make sure that you're focusing on solutions, whether that's tools, process, procedure, what have you, that can fix multiple holes, fix multiple gaps across multiple areas or multiple controls.
Yeah.
And one thing that you really highlighted in our conversation that I think is important to focus on is, hey, don't buy stuff before you're finished with an implementation group. And I just want to have you focus,
or at least until you've planned it holistically, right?
Yeah.
Like at least until you've planned it fairly holistically of what am I going to do? What products need to change? Those things are all part of that. And I don't know that it's necessarily a full IG before you buy products, but it's definitely an understanding of the breadth of what IG1 is, the planning of where your gap analysis is. I think you hit that nail right on the head of where am I on these things, right? When you do your business impact analysis in Control 2, which is a great way to get to the bottom of what software you have. So if you're looking at that, you're going to start doing things like, does this have MFA? Yes or no? Does this have SSO capabilities? Is it the right license? I mean, when I was at Iconic, I think we spent almost $100,000 a year in SSO tax just to have the right license to have the SSO I needed. I think Monday.com went from $2,500 a year to $25,000 a year. Like, let's just be honest about that delineation of that tax. It's massive. And so sometimes you may decide that the sensitivity of this data warrants moving to a different product, maybe using that product in a different way, upgrading its license, or potentially completely, putting in a compensating control and arguing that the sensitivity is not high enough to warrant that being the reason you make that decision. So I always like to try to bring it back to the impact. When we talk about cybersecurity, we're talking about the CIA triad. And that stands for confidentiality, integrity, and availability. And so when we're looking at and focusing on these safeguards and these controls, we need to make sure that we're actually honoring that. And if it's data that isn't all that sensitive, I might say, hey, we're still okay using monday.com because we're only using this. We contain no. And here's the process and the procedures and policies that must be in place so that people don't put data in there that changes its codified, risk to me, right, from that perspective. So I think to your point, it's all about the gap analysis. And as you're going through that gap analysis, you try to imagine, where can I solve this problem? What are things I could do? To your point, since we met, and maybe I'll save this for that 5 minutes at the end, Ian, but since we've met, I've started doing some of this work for MSPs, right? And we'll touch on that a bit, but I've started actually doing a mapping of CIS across products so they can visually see, oh, I could see how this facilitates this, or how this is a partial solve for that. And so we're actually doing that with language and guidance from the vendors. So really cool project to try to make that gap analysis easier. But
well, and so I want to highlight something, because we had a not so much a question as a request come in from the audience. That there's someone in the audience who, hey, the majority of their base is those 2 to 5 or 2 to 15 employee, like, micro organizations, and they mentioned baby steps, and really that gap analysis is your baby step.
Sure.
So you don't have to build Rome in a day, right? Like, sit down, create that thoughtful inventory of, like, hey, what are the systems and what's the criticality of the data in each of those systems, and what's our current state look like, right? Like, get yourself a picture of where you at, and where do you think, like, what does good look like for you and your customers, right? And that's going to be different for a 3-person auto mechanic shop versus a 500-person health system, right? There's different criticality there.
Absolutely. And I think you bring up an interesting point. That same 3-person could be working on missile parts, and you get into some interesting nature there. I will tackle something for Howard, though, on this that's maybe tangential. But you're also seeing a world where the technology is starting to support it at the 1 scale, right? If I spun up an Office 365 tenant at a 1-user license, I can do the exact same stuff I can do with 50 users, period. I can't have the same separation of duty clauses and the human side, but the tech side, I absolutely can set up an account for me as an admin and an account for me as a user. And I can have separate hats and separate me's, and I could live that world. And I would actually argue that the 2 to 15 is better represented now than they were years ago. Right. Exactly. You at Richard and Richardson, right? Same conversation. That's exactly how you're living. But yet you could meet all of these controls by having SSO sign into line of business applications with shared responsibility matrices, right? If I'm signing into a software and I'm bringing just my identity, then I'm controlling my identity. I'm controlling the MFA. I'm doing all these things. So, Howard, I would argue there's a woman by the name of Diana Giles, and she has crushed this with this conversation. She has had a client that was a 3-person client trying to meet a government contract, and they had all this big language, tons of stuff they had to do that was in this. It was like 7 pages. And she looked at this client and said, I can do all of this with M365, period. Okay, great. We're good. So I would put in this, Howard, that as you start taking it down to that 2 to 15, some of the challenges, though, there's not enough people for the hats. And oftentimes when you think in that space and at that size, you have to wear separate hats. My VP of operations, Tony Miller, literally in his office had a rack of 5 hats. And on these hats, he would have different, like VP of operations, general manager of Denver. And so he would wear different hats physically to put him in the position of what he was actually doing from a decision perspective. It was quite fun to watch. But in that space, oftentimes the MSP can serve as some of those hats. Right. And so that's actually a value prop for an MSP saying, hey, I have a way I set you up. It's the same for every client. These are the things I'm going to do. Here's what and when you get down to that, that makes that M365, and I won't be ignorant of Google or AWS and workspaces, whatever it may be. They all have similar capabilities. Microsoft's just probably the most well-rounded from an endpoint and overall control perspective. But you could scale something that goes to that 2 to 15 and hyperscale that. And now if you need to make a change to a control or something you've learned about this, or 8.1 comes out, you're doing that vis-a-vis the change to every client tenant the same exact way for the most part, as long as they don't have a bunch of LOB applications that are still AD, things like that. But short story is, Howard, I think that's changing drastically in the favor of that SMB, in my opinion.
And one One thing to just highlight there is as you kind of map out these hats, write it down.
That's a great point. If it's not
Right?
written down, it doesn't exist.
Yeah, map that accountability. Map out like, hey, this resides with the client, this resides with us, this resides with a third party.
Quick
Just put it down
quiz.
on paper.
Ian, have you been listening? What is that called? What is that mapping with a client called?
I don't pay attention when you talk, man.
I know. It's okay. I still love you. Anybody in the audience? It's a shared responsibility matrix.
Yes.
It's essentially you're trying to establish what is that line of demarcation of what I'm responsible for and what you're responsible for. I just led a tabletop exercise on that shared responsibility matrix at TSCCF last week. So good call out. I agree.
You got to remember though, Matt, I'm a sales guy. Okay.
I know.
Like
I know.
if everything gets hacked, man, I just need a phone that will dial and a pad of paper. I'm good.
Fair.
So
it's a new CRM.
That's right. That's right. We're going old school here. Carrier pigeons, here we come. So talk about iteration. Talk about iteration of security and iteration of frameworks, because that's really a kind of, we're talking about point 9, building on previous learnings and documentation, but just walk us through what iteration can look like and how you can even iterate your iteration process.
Yeah. I like to talk about this in my class. I teach a CIS class, and one of the classes I talk about is I show them 2 processes for rolling out antivirus for 10.1, right? For rolling out a malware program. One of them is I have my RMM deploy Sentinel-1. It gets it. We're good. I have a manual process to check to see if it shows up. I'm good. But I might iterate on that and say, you know what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to pull from the API whether or not the Sentinel-1 agent exists and the name of the machine exists with this same MAC address. And then if it doesn't, then I'm going to start off a process in my RMM to roll it out. But during that process, I'm going to check to see if the machine has 10% disk space available so I can have VSS. I'm going to check to make sure I have VSS pole positions so that I can actually have the ability to make a volume shadow copy and hopefully not get supplanted. But then after that, after I don't have those fail, but if they do, I'm going to send a ticket to the technician to ask them to sell a new machine. And if it doesn't, then I'm going to roll out Sentinel-1. And after I roll out Sentinel-1, I'm going to wait for it to show up in the console. I'm going to confirm in the API that it's shown up in the console. I'm going to make sure that it's there. I'm going to do its reboot, and I'm going to check to what is that difference in that process. And my point is, when you're looking at a control, it doesn't give you any granularity of having a good process. It just says have a process. If you look at Control 1.1, it says have a process to identify assets on your network. That could start with, I'm going to walk around and keep a manual spreadsheet and say what I see on the network. It could move towards active probing, passive probing, additional means of active probing, additional means of passive probing, and starting to get into that real robustness and richness of it. And when you look at, CMMC as a cybersecurity maturity model, they're all trying to be iterative. And so for me, it's a process of ensuring that you go back through the controls, looking at it with an understanding of, could this be better? Can I change the way we're doing this? Is there something fundamentally different available to me now than there used to be? I mean, heck, just follow Microsoft's release schedule and see how many times you'd have to iterate just based on their release. I mean, great example is, and this is maybe not in process as much as it is in procedure sometimes, but now that setting might include a conditional access policy that allows you to harden the tokens so that the tokens can't be stolen, like I'm going to demonstrate here in about 12 minutes for another stage. But, it makes it to where that's going to continue to evolve. And I think maybe that's what we're calling out here. We often as humans like to think of things as done. Right? We often as humans like to have this start and stop, especially as Americans in general, but we like to have this start and stop and a finality to something. This isn't one of those football games. This is an infinite game. I mean, Bob Coppage and I had a really great conversation about infinite games in that regard, but this is going to continue playing. And so if you're not continuing to improve your position, if you're not continuing to try to buy that last property on Monopoly or whatever it may be, then you're not going to continue to improve. So you have to have a plan to iterate. A great example is when you look at incident response, as you start to, as MSPs, having Control 17 very well mapped out and a good process in place, it calls for going back and doing an after the action review, right? And saying, hey, this is actually not good. We need to change. This failed. This is where we could have been better. This is where we could have not had this incident. And I think you should approach everything that way. it's just easier to do when you get punched in the face, right? You have clear and present failures. And so that's the other side of this, is test and inspect what you expect, as Rex Frank likes to say, right? Actually see if your controls are meeting. See if you can gather evidence from those controls actually doing something, or safeguards, I suppose. But yeah, anyways.
Yep. And so when it comes down to I want to circle back and touch on something you mentioned.
Oh, we got a great call out for responsible, accountable, consulted, informed. So
Yes.
Mike B with a racy comment. That makes me very happy, Mike. I love you. Sorry, nerding out here. That is how you approach things. And I actually proposed in our shared responsibility model using RACI as part of that shared responsibility. So you don't have as clear cut of delineations, right? It's now, I need to inform you of this. Hey, I might need to consult you about this, or you're accountable for this. And I'm maybe even responsible in that regard. Sorry, tangential. Sorry, Ian.
No, that's 100% agree. And kind of expanding on that, when it comes to policy and governance documentation, you're really looking at defining and through using that RACI mode, you really need to define what good looks like. But a core piece of that definition is you can't assume that assumptions will literally kill you.
And yet we all have to make them, right?
Yeah,
like,
we have to make them, but
yeah.
you can't assume that anyone will know what you know, even all the way down to the basic level,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, that's the teacher's dilemma, right?
Yeah.
Like that kind of is that point. And I think as you look at it, that is a great call out. So I will talk about a technical failure where I assumed and didn't test. And maybe I didn't have the capability to test, if I'm honest, at that time. And I think that's another part of this, that as you grow as a security professional, if you aren't looking back at your work last year and going, I'm an idiot, you probably aren't growing, right? Like, I can't tell you how many times I look back at a project and gone, man, what the hell was I thinking then? Right. And so you get into it. A great example of that was, there's a checkbox on CA, on conditional access inside Microsoft, that says, don't let this token be persistent. Meaning, if this token session is killed, then that token isn't going to be valid anymore. It's not persistent. And it's also intended, as it was described, to help you from having someone steal the token or an OAuth token and use it to authenticate as you and to be authorized to access the data. And so I believed it. I said it. I put it in my process document. It was what everybody had to do on every new tenant when they're setting up CA. It didn't work. In fact, I realized that the method of stealing the token doesn't terminate the session, especially an attacker in the middle or adversary in the middle type methodologies. And so when you start thinking about that, if I hadn't tested it, I'd just believed nobody could steal my token and use it. I'd have been assuming wrong in my level of exposure. And I know that's a little granular and a little technical, tactical, but the point being is you need to look for those opportunities where the process itself is full of escapement and things are getting through, and it's not, it's not been set up appropriately. And so that's why that iterative nature is, you should be continuing to question. And I think that's your point of continuing to say, is this even right? Am I even right? You also have to play devil's advocate as a general rule almost. So.
And before we kind of shift gears and talk about some management piece, I want to throw out a phrase that I know is just going to get you excited. This one I do remember, Matt. So talk a little bit about defensibility and reasonability.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
Like that's and we're at point 11 for folks. We're under kind of metrics and reporting, but especially in today's environment where litigation is increasing, not decreasing, and rejection of claims is skyrocketing from the cyber
prices are escalating, all of it.
And cyber insurance. Yeah. So talk to us about defensibility and reasonability.
Yeah, you're pulling my string on this one. So when you go through CISSP or CCSP or any of those certs, they talk about this reasonable person rule. In fact, they actually still call it the reasonable man rule, but let's just be more inclusive. So they talk about this reasonable person rule. And it says, listen, if a group of your peers were to find your actions, would they find them to be reasonable based on the given data? Essentially, it's kind of the concept. And since in cyber, we have very little precedence right now, legal precedence that has been established vis-a-vis cyber, especially around civil cases, the litigiousness of the due care side of it. It really comes down to being reasonable. And what I mean by that is, let's say I was installing SentinelOne from our earlier conversation. If my reasoning for why I was installing SentinelOne was, man, it's that new hotness, bro. Everybody's loving that EDR everybody's using right now. It's not going to be very defensible as a storytelling in front of a jury. However, if you were meeting those same peers and talking about reasonableness and said, I realized that through my CIS controls that I was implementing, because I didn't want to be the smartest guy or gal in the room anymore, that 10.1 calls out the need for an anti-malware product. 10.2 further specifies that it has this feature, and 10.3 says that. And I have 10.4 that says, and as a result, when evaluating the field, I felt that it was the one I could most best deal. Which one's reasonable? And I say that because we're not dealing with educated peers. Usually we're not dealing with tech people. I'm working with that sales guy named Ian or something, right? But the point is, we're not dealing with that. So we have to speak towards reasonable stories. So when I talk about reasonableness in the lens of documentation and proof and evidence, is if you can't prove it happened, it didn't happen. If you can't show that you started at version 1, and then I showed a revision of 1.1 and a revision of 1.2, 1.21, 1.22, 1.3, 1.31, 1.32 with reasonings and things that I changed and lessons I learned and stuff that doesn't that paint reasonableness, that you're doing your due care, that you're doing your due diligence, that you're moving forward with the body of evidence? If you just have a dusty document that sits on a shelf, you're not being reasonable. Now, getting back to defensibility, what is defensibility? Defensibility is meeting the actual challenge and the contractual language of what you said you were going to do in a way that's reasonable. And so I know it's a bit referential, but the point being, when it comes to defensibility of being able to protect yourself to that insurance company of saying, hey, I filled out that form and you checked you had MFA and you didn't have MFA on everything, and sorry. Yes, but if you'll refer to the addendum I added to that contract that said, here's the 72 systems we use, here's the 64 that I can do SSO on, here's the ones that told me to piss off and I have no control over, and here's the 2 that don't have MFA. We had on our POAM that we were deprecating the use of that software, and it gradually started. That's reasonable. And so I'm getting into this concept of defensibility against subrogation claims. If anybody's not familiar, subrogation is this understanding if Ian and I get in a wreck, and I'm over summarizing, and his insurance company pays his car and mine pays mine, the insurance companies are going to battle out as if they're Matt and as if they're Ian, and have the subrogable risk of who actually was responsible. Like, let's solve this, boys. You're going to pay me. You were responsible. And that's what happens in the back end of that. But we're seeing that same attribution being played out to MSPs from their client partners. My CISO was on a stage yesterday, and one of the guys from the insurance side was saying they're starting to come after even the CSPs. If the client doesn't have insurance, or they do and the insurance company pays, then the MSP doesn't have insurance. They're talking about coming after the CSPs. And so we're getting into a world of risk that's changing drastically and rapidly. You're also seeing that same concept play out from the Federal Trade Commission. They started suing under the False Claims Act, an 1863 law. All right, they're suing on that for government contracts. In fact, they awarded almost 300 million in whistleblower payments last year. That's a third of what was sued for. So they sued for $1 billion to people in the American public for not meeting their obligations contractually. And these are just 2 of probably 12 or so things that are playing out right now that are shifting the landscape so drastically. And so as you're building this process, people want to see the cake being made. People want to be able to see the reasonableness of your actions, the decisions of where you improved this little bit or that little bit. And I learned this little bit and I changed that little bit. And I would assert that if you are meeting that standard of reasonableness through those actions, you're going to find yourself in a pretty good state from a risk perspective of some of those downline lawsuit type risks or service provider risks against your contract. The other thing I'd add to it, without not making Brad Gross's ghost roll over in the grave, is make sure you're meeting your contractual obligations and that your contract actually aligns with the things you're saying you're going to do as well. But yeah, that's my definition of kind of what is reasonableness and what is that due care kind of concept of this as being an MSP. It's all about showing the cake being made.
One of the things that we did was with every single action or software or what have you that we had at my old MSP, we just had a set. This wasn't anything fancy. It was some spreadsheets and Word documents, right? Like Times New Roman left justified stuff.
Yeah.
That said, like, hey, we use this piece of software. Here are the goals for using this software. Here's what our objectives are with using it. Here's how we configure it, etc. And then when we went through client systems, we would do the same thing. Like, hey, here's your software. Here's what it is. Here's the steps we've taken to secure it.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3. And it wasn't anything super fancy, But when we came in and took over the account from whatever, an in-house guy, a different MSP, some dude who lives in a van down by the river, which
down by the river,
describe me now these days.
Yeah, it's fair.
That like we were walking into blank sheet of paper. There was nothing documented at all. And so just even doing that simple thing was leaps and bounds beyond anyone else in our market when we were doing this. And this is 5 years ago type stuff.
I will tell on myself, if you've ever been in these shoes, when we were still about a $3 million MSP, at that transition point, revenue-wise annually, well, at that transition point, we were full of rock stars, right? We were full of people that that were really good at what they did. And I sat in a leadership meeting one time, and I'll look back on this and just know how dumb I am. But I literally questioned, as we were talking about implementing process and documenting things, I literally said, do we even want to be a process-driven company? Like, I was the naysayer in this of going, no. And it was because I was a rock star, and I did enjoy shooting from the hip, and I do enjoy shooting from the hip, right? And so the challenge was now telling on myself, I don't think you can ever build defensibility on look at this rock star. I don't think that's a reasonable way to reach that. So anyways, but I at least tell on myself. I'm not making others do it. So
a couple of quick questions, which are pretty straightforward, is Matt, you mentioned the mappings to vendors product or document that you've been building, Matt. Is that something that's publicly accessible to folks? And then a secondary question is just how can someone register for that CIS class that you host?
Yeah. And clarification, Sherry, it's a CIS class, not a CISSP class, although I would love to teach a CISSP class eventually. But yeah, for the document around that mappings, it's right now it's PAX 8 intellectual property. It's not something that's out yet. We're doing a few things with it. We're going to eventually surface it in our platform. We're looking at it from a couple of lenses. Running a team doing it. But the first lens is, does this product help me meet a CIS control, right? If it's a DMARC product, does it help me meet 9.5 implementing DMARC? Yep, check, 100%. But we're also looking at some of the partiality. And what I mean by that is, let's say we had an email backup product and we were looking through the lens of the 11 controls, which means have automated backup. I'm only partially meeting that control by using this one product because email isn't everything I might need to back up. And so we're looking at it from that lens of partiality, fully meeting, or facilitating, which is a third part of this first lens, which is, does this product help me facilitate something? For example, 1.1 says have a process to find devices. Well, any product isn't going to be the process. It could be a component facilitating said process. And so we're doing that work first. The second lens we're looking at is, if I use this product, does it invalidate my ability to use this product and controls? By that, I mean, what if a product doesn't have SSO? I'm not going to be able to meet 5.6. What if they don't offer SCIM provisioning and group management or JIT group management for me to bring back my RBAC or ABAC back to my identity provider? So that can't meet 6.7. So we're taking certain questions and asking each vendor, do you encrypt end to end? Do you encrypt the backup? Do you back up your own stuff? I like to call that the rack space question. But sorry, a little too soon. But short story is, I'm going to be surfacing those two. Initially, they're going to live in some GRC platforms that I won't name just because of NDAs today. And we're going to make it to where you could actually literally look at our line card in a platform and go, if I use these 9 tools, they should solve these 26 controls or whatever it may be, or safeguards. It's tough because it's objective work. And one of the other sides of that is, I don't want to put words in a vendor's mouth that they aren't capable of backing up. And I also don't want to take words out of their mouth that they would have used by not letting them be part of it. So a lot of this work is being done with the vendors, and I'm at like 35 meetings this month of this. So it's going to be released probably before the end of the year. We'll have this up and available. Other places you might be able to find it too. I plan on sharing some of this IP with a few other places. So yeah, anyways, sorry, tangential, but yes, it's coming soon.
Coming soon. And then for CIS registration, is that just like a paxi.com thing? Go there.
Yeah, you go in the panel and check out. I teach 2 classes. One is applying CIS controls. That we do that every quarter, I think twice a quarter. And then I have another one, which is developing security policy, that I co-teach with Sheldon Phillips. So that's how you would get access to that. Thanks for the question. I'd love to see you.
And then one final question, and I'm going to kind of chunk this one out. Sherry had asked, hey, as an MSP, how do we minimize exposure, implement this, and make money? And so first off, I'm going to take that first part, minimize exposure, and say third rail. We're not going to talk about that. Exposure is one of those magical words that my lawyer has clued me into that do not talk about on any sort of recorded webinar ever. So exposure and risk is really, really dicey because it can stray into that legal arena.
Yeah.
So like you gotta have those conversations. But Sherry, if you want to ping either Matt or I, and our contact info will be at the end of the webinar. If you want to ping either of us, we're super visible on LinkedIn. One can connect you to the other to have maybe a bigger question answer on that offline. But when it comes to implementation, right, the process document that we have here really kind of lays out some good guidelines on this, but just it's the same way you eat an elephant, one bite at a time.
Yeah.
When it comes to making money off of this, the way that you do this is by face-to-face sit downs on a per client basis.
Yep.
Don't try to do email marketing on this. To go sit down and say, hey, look, a lot of stuff out in the news, want to have a conversation about risk, and bring a list of questions. Bring your biggest impact items and explore what that means. So, hey, we're looking into things. I've got this list of systems, and I just want to understand if this system went down, how does that impact your world and the organization's world? Right. And so I'll use healthcare as an easy example. EMR goes down. You can't sit. Can you still see patients?
Yep.
Can you still make money? Like, what's the impact of what's the actual practical impact of the practice of the EMR being down? And you'd be surprised how much this varies practice to practice. What's the impact of the practice management being down? If you deal with OBGYN, EMR is important, practice management's important, but the most important system in that building is ultrasound.
Right.
Period, full stop, everything. That is what prints their money more than the doctors, more than surgeries, more than hospital visits. It's running those damn ultrasounds.
Well,
closely followed are NSTs. And so you have to understand what the priorities in those businesses are. And so walk through the systems, ask what happens if they go down, and then talk about these controls and say, look, this is all about preventing the system from going down. That's what it means, right? A hacker gets in and steals all your data systems.
Threat actor. I'm a hacker.
Yeah, threat actor, whatever, right? I'm not gonna differentiate hacker, cracker, threat actor, whatever, right? Like Bob
better for me.
Yeah,
no, I tease.
If Bob Coppage down in Ohio gets into your system, see what I did there?
I see. Bob Coppage will get in your systems. I hear of him.
So, if someone you don't want in gets into your and does something bad and takes the system down, define what the impact is and talk about what they're willing to do to prevent that outcome. Because that's really what we're talking about. It's just, look, if someone gets in, they're going to take the system down. They always will.
And document that you had the conversations and document the outcomes of those conversations, right? And drive that reasonableness conversation. I won't speak towards exposure because of your point, but I will say in the spirit of this, it is, how do I do all this and still make money? Let's tackle that. There's another force at play too. If you mind following along, please launch Angry Birds and tell me how many times you have to go call your support team. It is 0, right? Like ultimately. And I think the point is that we're seeing technology get easier. We're seeing the commoditization of what we do as technical people, right? If you even look back, when as MSPs do we decide we had to have a VCIO, we had to have strategists, and we had to have all these other things? Why? Well, it's because we weren't offering as much value on the technical side. Things got easier. Things worked better. You moved everybody Office 365, and all of a sudden you lost a lot of the exchange problems you had. And now you move to this, and now your identity challenges are getting easier. And now you're moving to, and so I think part of the answer, Sherry, in my opinion, it's an opinion, it doesn't make me right, is that as that commoditization continues to play out, the value statement will shift that some of this effort and work that you are doing is the value prop. And I think the security and that deep consultative aspect is what I see so much in the future, to Ian's point of having a conversation and sitting there understanding their business is going to be how you help them win in technology, but also in security. And I think that's the kind of point is I feel very deeply that commoditization has already played a part. And as we continue to see that, this is what that shift will be. I've seen MSPs that are adding GRC or governance, risk, and compliance programs into their already seat price, their 200 something plus seat price, right? As things commoditize away. And I'll tell this a different way. Back to my story for Howard earlier. When I converted my first couple of clients to that model I talked about. They were Azure Active Directory, they were Intune, they were autopilot managed, they automatically reset. I had most of my controls done in a fashion I could just show an auditor. I could prove they were compliant. In fact, I could prove they couldn't touch the data if they weren't compliant. I could do a lot of things. But when I first started doing those things and I didn't understand the security part, but much more just the productivity part, those first clients fired me. And the reason they fired me when I asked them as they explained this out was, stuff just works, Matt. I don't have any of those problems anymore. And I didn't have an answer as to how you filled that gap. In my mind, it was, we're going to be better at teaching how to use Teams than others. We're going to help make you more extensible using those tools in front of you. But the second part of that is just this. It is the work that it takes to stay in a level of defensibility and reasonability around how you apply your security process. I tell people, I get on stage to shock MSPs a lot, and I'll say, your job is not to protect your client's network. Your job is to be defensible in how you choose to do so. And I think the point that I'm trying to make is that that's where, to Sherry's question, I feel like we're drifting to where, as you continue to learn and flex these muscles and drive it, there will be ways you monetize it, just like we first monetized VCIOs at some point. And just like we first did those things, if you were around during that time doing it, I feel like it's going to be the same for security. And it already has played that way. When I first did my first security bundle, I was like, I need to charge you $25 more so I can put in SentinelOne and a this and a that. And then eventually it just started being part of the seat price, right? Ultimately, it was just part of that higher seat price that we expected. So I do think it's shifting.
And there's a lot of different ways you can skin this cat. I'll do that, and then we're going to kind of shift gears a little bit here. But not everything needs and this is going to be an unpopular opinion in the space, but not everything needs to be a recurring billable item. So you can go to your clients and say, hey, would you rather pay one-time things on a routine cadence? So once every quarter, once every 6 months, what have you, once a month, would you rather, pay some things on a routine cadence, or have your monthly billing go up and we just automatically do some things around security? But have the conversation with the businesses and figure out, like, what's the majority of your client base leaning towards, right? Do they want to have you come out once a year and say, all right, like, here's what we got to handle this year. Here's a budget, and pay a professional services rate? Or are they going to pay, like, hey, just charge us $10, $15 more a user and do what you need to do, and just let us know.
We've played both of those coins before. Right? They each have their drawbacks, right? But,
exactly. There's no perfect fit for everyone. Or there's a third thing that we're not even talking about, right? Like, think outside the box and just go and do that. But start off with a conversation about what risk is and about what's going on. And say, look, I'm not going to try to just sell you something to sell you something. Yeah. What I want to do is I want to have a thoughtful, considerable, consultative discovery about how you use your technology and what the impacts are if something bad happens to individual pieces. And then we can make a plan that works for you from there. Yeah. That's the conversation. And when you go to a reasonable business owner and you phrase it in that way, I'm going to be very, very shocked if someone says, I'm not interested in talking to you about that.
Yep. The other side of this coin, too, that I don't want people to miss is sometimes it's quite effective just to be prescriptive. When I go to my doctor, they don't sit in that waiting room before they come in to see me, and him and Haw, oh, man, I'm not sure if I tell Matt he's fat and has high blood pressure, he's going to want to deal with both of them. Let's just tackle that high blood pressure today, and we'll leave the...
You're big bone, man. Come on,
I'm big bone. I'm thick, right? But the point is they don't have that compulsion. And the reason is they have the Hippocratic Oath. They have this understanding of, at first, they must do no harm. They must understand that their job is the medical practice, not necessarily the patient's feelings. And they try to do the best from a bedside perspective. But at the end of the day, they prescribe me a medicine to fix my blood pressure and tell me you need to start losing weight, guy. And so I think as an MSP, when I did that, when we realized that Microsoft wasn't backing up Office 365 and it was in our best interest to follow Control 11.2 in our own way, and we said, you know what, we're going to go down that path. I didn't talk to my clients. I sent out an email and said, hey, I just want you to know I'm going to be turning this on. It's going to be $3 a head, and we're going to make this change. Let me know if you don't want to do it. And I want to flip that in a real quick thought, right? Is that if I was just trying to chase everybody down and have the meetings, it'd take me a year. But if I simply put it out there and let the 3 people, that's what it was, out of those, basically 100 clients, the 3 people that came and said no, we talked 2 of them into it, 1 didn't do it, and we had the ability to make a decision. I had enough revenue to fire that client if that was my decision from the growth in this other revenue that instantly turned on. I had an instant run rate. I didn't wait on the run rate to get where it needed to be. It was instantly there. Don't be afraid to be prescriptive sometimes. Use your judgment, understand the risk. But I would say that's the other side people miss. Anyways, sorry.
Yeah, no, that's kind of, you have to go back and forth, right? And think about it reasonably as to like, what's this going to impact? But if you're just turning on something like hey, we're going to deploy Sentinel-1. That was how we handled that conversation is, look, everyone's getting Sentinel-1. We're not going to tolerate this anymore. If you don't like
I'm doing this. Yeah, let me know.
Right. Here's your bill. It's going on this day. We've been testing in your environment for 45 days already. And ate the cost of the deployment, and you're going to start getting billed on it in May, right? Like
exactly.
And we had one person come back and complain about the price, and when we told them, we said, "Hey, look, it's either this or we're happy to collect documentation and help you offboard, but we're not willing to be connected with you because it's too big of a risk for us."
100%.
And that's that does have to be sometimes the tact. So, shifting gears, Matt, like. If anyone on the call doesn't know who Pax8 is, please get out of your rock, right? Like, okay, it's there. They help people in a lot of different ways. There's a lot of different things they do. But before you dive into what you do at Pax8, just talk about this this little web URL that's out there and kind of the CyberMatly ecosystem that's going on, and shaving some beards and stuff like that, and then. And just share a little bit about Pax8 and what you guys bring to the table too, and then we'll open it up for any final questions.
So I'll tell you a secret. We all die. I don't know if anybody was familiar with that concept in life. If I've shocked you,
everybody exits.
And for me, and Ian, you share a lot of this too. I found that I had grown a persona in what I do, and that I had the ability to make an impact. And as a result, you and I and Carrie established and set up 15 of us or 16 of us to shave our beards. And we raised $202,000 in charity funds. And I think for me, it's if I have a platform I want to give back, cybermatly.com started when I was still at an MSP, and I wanted to start creating content to educate other MSPs and educate other people. And it's really just kind of taken on a life of its own as a personal brand. I think maybe if I was to add anything else for anyone is go establish your brand, right? If you're an MSP or a partner, go out and educate your customers, drive that business. And for me, cybermatly.com is where I bring a lot of that home. It also shows up a lot in ChatGPT, which is nice when I search for some of the stuff that I'm looking for. No, I digress. But no, that's my site. If you want to connect with me, it gets you to my LinkedIn. It'll get you to my YouTube. It'll get you to anything we've got going on. Ian and I are starting a foundation together and looking to make this more constant thing. Ian, Carrie, and I suppose I'm being not so normative, but and Kat, yep, fair, and my wife. But yeah, so I want to give back. But Pax8, when we speak on that, they are awesome. They sponsor me literally just educating, teaching, learning, and working with MSPs, and pay for me to do so. And it's interesting. But yeah, if you're not a Pax8 partner, you really should be, for sure. I'm not a sales guy, but that's my one plug that I'll give out there. But we are trying to tackle a lot of the things around normalizing the security discussion, right? Pax8 was one when I was, just to tell you how I got to Pax8, when I was doing those 26 different advisory councils over those years, I really tried to judge where can I make the most impact? Where am I actually going to get something done? And Pax8 was an 8.5 out of 10, and nobody else was close, just because of how much the executives listened and wanted to understand how they could serve us as MSPs. And they were the first ones to do SSO for me without any cost or without any change. They're the first one to say, yeah, we'll toss in any SSO you want, Matt. How do you want to see it? And so I will say Pax8's a great distributor. We're a great educator, and we're going to keep adding stuff there. So please check us out. But to the question of my class, it is, I think, paid. I do believe. I know they charge for it in Academy, but we do some sponsorship and scholarship things as well. So yeah, awesome.
And then for those of you who are on the call, don't forget to grab that process. It's in the upper right-hand corner. It's right under the handouts item. I definitely love Pax8 too, Howard. So that's everybody's throwing some Pax8 love. We were a Pax8 partner for years and years and years, all the way up until I sold my MSP, and there's still a Pax8 partner. There's nobody better in the market that I can think of that does what they do. So It's definitely a rock star partner there. But Matt, we've got about a minute 15 left. So what's kind of a final takeaway for everyone to close us out with?
Yeah. Don't ever be embarrassed. Don't ever think poorly of yourself or your security knowledge. And don't ever think you're a 10 in security knowledge. I think I do this exercise where I ask people to raise their hands. These are usually practitioners of, if you think your MSP or you are above a 4 in cybersecurity knowledge, a 5, a 6, a 7, an 8. And so many people raise their hands as a 7, and then we get started in our class and they go, I'm a 2. And I think that's the humility of it. I don't ever want to be called an expert. I'm not that guy. I think it's all about how do we continue to learn and be humble and help each other grow. So that'd be my takeaway: is don't be arrogant, don't be afraid, and don't put yourself down. Just keep growing. That's all we have to do. So, thanks for having me on.
I am proudly a 1, and the reason I get the 1 is because I just listen to when you say something. I go, all right, I should figure out what that means.
All God's children got a talent.
So. That's right. Mine's just not being smart.
Whatever. Thanks for having me on, man. And if anybody connect with me on LinkedIn, shoot me questions, even give counterpoints. But looking forward to seeing y'all in my